red dot, so I think we're live here. So it's always a little bit scary. Okay, are we doing everything? We got everything together here, doing what we're supposed to do. But this lesson, we're in John chapter 9 this week, and I don't know about you, but I was thankful for this lesson. As I was writing your lesson was during that time that I had to cancel a week. I had other things I had going on that I had to see to, and I thought, well, at least I know this story. At least I already know this, and I know where this is going, and if I don't get anything else done this week, I can at least say what I know about it, and we can go with that. But I was thankful this week, too, as I was working on going back and studying it again. I was thankful for it. It was almost like taking a breath, It's just this intensity that we've dealt with in these chapters 7 and 8 particularly, and we'll be back in again next time. It's like we were when we did chapter 6, the first part of chapter 6. You remember the feeding of the 5,000? Everybody knows the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And we just sort of like we took a breath before we jumped back into the deep end of the pool again. And so that's what we'll do with chapter 10. But this has always been one of my favorite stories in the Bible. And Joe will say, well, whatever you're reading at the moment is your favorite story in the Bible or your favorite book in the Bible. But this one is especially a favorite of mine. If you've heard me teach for very long at all, you've probably heard me mention this story because I keep going back to it so many times. And I knew, as we'll get to that one famous line that the man says, but I knew the setting of the story was within a controversy with the Pharisees, but I didn't know its setting within Jesus' ministry, where throughout his 3.5-year ministry, where it took place, what was the setting around it, what else was going on. I didn't know all that about it. And it came up in this controversy that we're seeing with the Pharisees, or the Jews, as John calls them many times. It came up last week in the Tuesday night group, just how were the Pharisees to know who Jesus really was? How were they to know that he was who he said he was? And the question even came up, are we being too hard on the Pharisees? I mean, after all, if we had been there, would we be any better than they were in recognizing Jesus? And as I was thinking about that, a lot of times what will happen in the other lessons, I will make notes and that will carry over into what I think about during the week in preparing to go into the next lesson. As I was thinking about that, it reminded me of an incident that took place shortly after Joe and I were married. So we would have been, 21, 22, somewhere along in there, just mere children. But we were attending this Bible study down at Sand Branch United Methodist Church that Evelyn Laycock was teaching. If you've ever had the opportunity to hear Evelyn Laycock teach, absolutely, she's passed away now, but absolutely one of the best Bible study teachers I have ever known. And precious, precious woman, just loved her dearly. But anyway, she was teaching, and all the churches, we had this, I forget what we called it. It was a Forks of the River group co-op or something, anyway, with several of the Methodist churches around at that time. And so Joe and I, we were members at Bethel at that time, and so we were riding to this study with George and Anna Mary McNutt. Now, I don't know if some of you will remember George and Anna Mary McNutt, just, again, precious saints of the church. But as we were leaving there one night, I said, I just don't get it. Why were the Pharisees so angry with Jesus? And George said, you got to just slow talking guy. Well, he told them they were wrong. No one likes to be told that they're wrong. And that was it. That was the perfect answer. And that prompted me to write a poem. And I don't remember all of it, and I didn't have time to search for it. I'm not sure exactly where it's at. I know I've still got it somewhere. But anyway, it starts out this way. Lord, I'm afraid of what I might do If you came today, Lord, would I crucify you? Your disciples we call great men of great faith, but would I be that sure if we came face to face? Lord, I'm afraid of what I might do. If you came today, Lord, would I crucify you? And that, played a lot in my mind over the years of just how would I react being in that place. We'll go into a little bit more detail on this next week as we get into chapter 10, and we once again find Jesus in this debate or this argument with the Pharisees. But just to give you a clue, we'll look at one sign or one way that they should have known or they should have recognized who Jesus was in tonight's lesson, as he does something that no one else has ever done, and that is heal the sight of someone born completely blind. Warren Wiersbe in his commentary said, the greatest miracle was not the opening of his eyes, but the opening of his heart, and it cost the man everything. Oh, and by the way, Wiersbe titled this chapter, I thought this was so cool, he titled it, The Blind Man Calls Their Bluff. I thought that was kind of cute. So, but to be honest with you, as I began writing this lesson, as I began studying it and putting the writing together, I had a hard time knowing, as I was writing your lesson, I had a hard time knowing what to ask because it's a narrative. What did he say? Then what did he say? Then what did he do? What did he do? I mean, how much more than that can you actually say? And then, as I began working on it from this end, what else can I say? It's just a very straightforward story. But maybe we'll learn something new, and I hope you've learned something new as you've studied it. Maybe it triggered something as you read or some of the other scriptures, but we'll see what we learn together from it. So let's look at the overview. Was this a familiar story to you? John chapter 9. Your nodded head doesn't pick up on the microphone.
Yes.
Yes, okay. And no rattling of heads. Yes, it was a familiar story. But did you see anything new that you didn't realize was there? Or what else hit you about this as you read this chapter? And we did the whole chapter this time. So
The blind man was really quite intelligent.
yeah.
He spoke with intelligence and confidence, and you wouldn't think somebody that had been blind from birth would have that much confidence to speak that boldly.
Right. And not only that, but probably no education at all, no schooling of any kind at all. Mm-hmm. But think about what you might gain as you've sat there at the temple gates for who knows how many years, what you would overhear. Because you couldn't see, if you've known anybody with a as we call it, a birth defect or a loss of something, that how the other senses pick up.
We call that the School of Hard Knocks.
School of Hard Knocks, yeah, mm-hmm. Exactly. What else? Anything else that hit you about this?
Well, one thing that the Pharisees kept, asking the man how he had received his sight, and I hadn't realized this before. They were drilling him because they wanted to see if Jesus had done any work on the Sabbath,
yeah.
Or how it happened.
Yeah, I didn't realize it was a Sabbath day either. So yeah, it just kept on asking the same things.
And then they saw it. Oh, he worked. He made mud.
He worked. He did. He made mud. He made a mud pie.
I didn't remember that they had a discussion with his parents.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. What did you think about his parents?
They were very safe with their answers.
Yeah. They were.
Oh, I could have said, well, ask him.
Yeah. He's grown up. Ask him. Yeah. Anything else? Did it raise any questions for you? Is there, like I said, it's a very straightforward story. Did it take you on any rabbit trails? I'm always going on a rabbit trail somewhere.
Verse 39. I have come to judge the world.
Yeah.
We have heard over and over and over, I am not here to judge. But now he's come to judge the world. And you have to have an open mind about that.
Yeah. How does that fit together? He's not here, but he is. Yeah.
Makes you think about it a lot.
Yeah, exactly. Anything else?
Jesus went and found the man after they cast him out, and it made me think, does he not come and find us when we're cast out?
Yes, absolutely. And this is one of those scriptures that a lot of the commentaries, particularly there's different kinds of commentaries. There are commentaries that are very technical, tells you what the words mean, what the tenses of the words are, ties it in with other scriptures, just very technical, not easy reading kind of commentaries. And then there are commentaries that are more devotional type commentaries that you can actually, J. Vernon McGee's one, William Barclay is another. William Barclay's commentaries are actually even divided up in such a way that they would make a nightly devotional reading so that you could... it's broken down in a way that it's just a paragraph or a page or two reading where you can, read a little bit every night. So, bless her heart, Amy did. It's dark, Amy. I didn't see you go by and wave.
No, I didn't.
Well, that is Amy. Oh, yeah, I got your mask. Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. That's all right. We're doing the overview now. What new about this? But I don't even know where I was at. What was I saying? Replay.
Does Christ seek us out?
Oh yeah, seek us out. Yeah. The commentaries, the devotional type commentaries. A lot of the devotional type commentaries actually went into that a lot where this is a picture of salvation. The man was blind. There was nothing he could do about it. He was just in that condition. Jesus came to him and healed him. And then when the world cast him out, Jesus went to him and sought him. So yeah, there are a lot of spiritual things about this chapter besides just the fact that it's a real story. A lot of times we talk about, particularly I do, it's one of my favorite things, is Old Testament history. And although everything that happened in the Old Testament is real stories, real events happening to real people, these things are as real as you can get in real life, yet so many of them are pictures or examples. As I have a hard time remembering, I think it's 1 Corinthians 10 that Paul talks, that whole chapter, Paul talks about these things happen to them as examples for us. And so all of this in chapter 9, because even though it is a real story, this really happened to this man, still it is a picture, and we can see spiritually how it relates to just the general healing and the general call of the sin-sick soul that Jesus draws in. And we won't get into it in this lesson, but as we go from chapter 9 over into chapter 10, we will see how that flows together, how this one being cast out and called in hears as his master's voice. You think of the RCA commercial, the dog hears his master's voice, but the sheep hears the shepherd's voice. So that'll be for another lesson. But yeah, that's a very important part of this story. Anything else? All right, Elaine, would you get me a bottle of water? I forgot to get one. I'm getting dry. Thank you. Okay, getting into the questions. Okay, so where are we? Chapter 9 continues from chapter 8, and this intense debate or conversation between Jesus and the Pharisees continues on. Let me get this. Thank you. As you remember, as chapter 8 finished up, this conversation had evolved into almost a shouting match. At least on the Pharisees' side, he was. Jesus was very calm and cool and collect, but on the Pharisees' side, they were out of control. So look back at verse 58 of chapter 8. And Jesus, the last thing he says to them is, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am. And that was those two distinct Greek words. They knew exactly what he was saying. He was saying, I am. I have the name of God. I am God. And they knew that. And therefore, verse 59, they, the Pharisees, the Jews, picked up stones to throw at him. But Jesus, it says, hid himself and went out of the temple. And then verse 1 of chapter 9 said it. And as he passed by, as he's going out of the temple, as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. Now, remember, this is still the 8th day of that Feast of Tabernacles. This from, where was it? Chapter 7, verse 37 was the 7th day of the feast. And then from after that, particularly beginning in chapter 8, verse 1, all through chapter 8 is that 8th day. Now, what was special about that 8th day?
They rested.
Huh?
They rested.
They rested, but why? Why did they rest? What was that day considered? That day was a Sabbath day. You can go back. It's in Leviticus. I forget off the top of my head chapter and verse. But as it describes this Feast of Tabernacles, the first day and the 8th day were considered Sabbath days, regardless of what day of the week they fell on. So they were Sabbath days. So the Pharisees were so angry there in verse 59 that they actually picked up stones to throw at Jesus. Now some translate the word to throw or to cast, the tense of that they were already throwing. They weren't just getting ready to throw. They were already throwing them. But here's the thing. Their anger had so overtaken them that they themselves were actually breaking the Sabbath, because the Sabbath law was you could not pick up anything or carry anything heavier than a dried fig. So I doubt they were picking up little tiny stones. Yeah, pebbles. They were picking up big stones. So they themselves were actually breaking the Sabbath. And so they were throwing them. And what did Jesus do? He walked out. It says he hid himself. Now, we don't know exactly what happened there. As we ended last week, we said, how could he do that? And the answer was because it was not his time. It was not his hour. So they were not going to hurt him. But let's think about it literally. How did that happen? Well, we don't know. It just says he hid himself. Nobody really knows what that means. Some commentaries said that the Pharisees were blinded. It was just like a curtain over their eyes that he was able to walk through, and they didn't see him. Others said that he just disappeared in the crowd. Others said, well, these disciples sort of shielded him. I don't see that happening, but that could have been what that was. But at any rate, he concealed himself. As we closed last time, like I said, we just said whatever it was because it wasn't his hour. They were not going to hurt him. But here's the thing that really strikes me, because chapter 8 flows into chapter 9. He was obviously in no hurry. Because verse 1 of chapter 9 says, and as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. Now, apparently he stopped, or he did something. Whether he gestured toward the man, or whether he stopped, or acknowledged the man in some way, we don't know what he did, but apparently he did something to cause the disciples then to ask him a question. Because these beggars were sitting there all the time. Some different kinds of infirm people were sitting there all the time. I mean, think about this. If you really wanted to tug on people's heartstrings as they were going into the temple to make their sacrifices for all the sins they had committed, don't you think that'd be the perfect place to be? Here, you give me some money, and you can ease your conscience a little bit, At least get some brownie points or something, you know. So these infirm people were there all the time. But so Jesus had to have done something to draw attention to this particular man. But before we look at that question, this is what I want you to think about. How do you suppose they knew that he had been blind since birth? It says, as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. Now, how do you know that? If you see somebody out and they've got some kind of injury, illness, whatever, is there any way to know how long they've dealt with that?
They had to know. Yeah.
They may have known it. They may have known this man from his childhood. He's been there as long as I can remember. But even at that, unless they knew him when he was born, they wouldn't have known. That's one possibility. Any other thing you can think of?
God knows us in the womb. So
Yes.
Jesus knows.
Yes, Jesus knows us in the womb. That is exactly right. And he saw a man blind from birth. But the way the disciples are speaking, they know it too. So think about this. There are many scriptures that tell us that Jesus healed blind people. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But this is the only one of whom we are told he was blind since birth. So,
There's a lot of references to his parents. We ask who sent him or his parents.
Yeah.
Obviously, they were familiar with the story and asked specifically about the parents. So I took that to mean that they had a long history.
May have. But think about this. Could it have been that the man had no eyes at all?
Doesn't say who that he has or doesn't have.
No.
So he could have no eyes at all.
Or at least no irises. If you've seen pictures or seen anyone that was blind where it just looked like a white ball, the eyes were not developed. That's what comes to my mind when I think about this man. And I think probably the reason that I think of that is my sister was deaf. And she was deaf because there was no connection from the eardrum to the inner ear. It simply did not develop. And so there would have been no way to, well, there may be today, there may be such surgeries today that they could do for that. But, let's see, she was 17 years older than I was. So, born in the 30s and late 30s, there was no such kinds of surgery. So I think about this man, and I think about it is likely that just looking at him, they knew this man has never seen. It wasn't like there had been an injury. There wasn't like, and I'm speculating, of course, but possibly not like there was a scar across the eye where there'd been an injury or it looked like there'd been an illness. It could have been that it was obvious that he had never been able to see at all. But whatever it was, Jesus had healed others. But there was something about this man. Think about all that Jesus has done up to this point. We are about 6 months from the last Passover when he'll be crucified. So we're already at 3 years past. Think about the number of people that Jesus has healed. But yet, when they stop at this man, there is no indication that it even crosses the disciples' minds that he might heal him. Because everybody that Jesus has healed had something to work with beforehand. And this man maybe didn't have anything to work with. But instead of thinking that Jesus was stopping to heal him, what did they say? The disciples asked Jesus, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? Now, why would they say such a thing?
Because that was the belief then.
Yeah.
That sickness came from sin.
Yeah. And not only did sickness come from sin, something as radical as someone who had never been able to see. That was even more extreme than an illness or an accident. And I gave you, of course, the scripture of Job. I mean, Job's 3 friends tried their best to convince him that he'd done something to be in the shape that he was in. There were a lot of different things that I found in the commentaries about blindness. And there was, and in fact, from what I read, it's still, like in third world countries, can happen this way, that venereal disease can cause blindness. If the child in the birth canal contracts that it can cause such infection in the eyes that it can cause blindness. So that was a thing that took place in Jesus' day. So who sinned? Was it his parents' sin that was the reason he was born blind? My mother had the German measles. That's how my sister ended up deaf. Just, would you call that a sin? No, it was just something that happened. But it was something that happened that had a result. And so, who did this? Was it something the parents did? What was it? Something? Who sinned? The parents or the child? Now, why would they think the child had sinned?
Well, in the Old Testament, you didn't sin against God and get by with it.
Yeah, but how could a baby sin? Because that's what they asked. Who'd sin? The child or his parents?
Well, God went back 3 generations and caused people to pay for their sins.
There were
their ancestors' sins.
It wasn't, and I'll get you for that kind of thing. But the things that they did caused this to happen to your bodies or whatever, and caused the consequences of sin. Mm-hmm. The consequences of sin. I don't care if you're forgiven, there are still consequences to sin. Exodus 20 verse 5 says that the sins of the fathers would be visited on the children. Now, there are people who talk about something called generational curses. But in Ezekiel 18, God told Ezekiel not to say that anymore. He basically said everyone's responsible for their own sin. He said, I believe it's in verse 4, he said, you have heard it said that the fathers eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. And he said, but that's, and I forget the exact wording, but to paraphrase, that's not to be. That's not the way it is. Everyone will answer for their own sin. Because I don't believe that God has any grandchildren and everyone has to come to him on their own. I don't believe in generational curses. That's my belief. But there were others that believed in reincarnation. There are religions today that believe in reincarnation, and you are where you are in life because of what you did in a prior life. You're either better or worse or something, depending on what you did in a prior life. And another thing was that some believed that that souls were like kind of in a holding place waiting for the child was born, then a soul was placed into it. So, when I was a kid, that's what I used to think. God had this, there was all these souls, and when a baby was born, then he would give them one. Things go through kids' minds. But anyway, the thing that really struck me about this, though, is that here they are standing around discussing this poor man's blindness. I mean, did you picture this taking place?
And he could still hear.
Yeah, of course he can hear. Bless his heart. I've always felt for him. It's like, what am I over here, chopped liver? He's sitting there and they're discussing him just like
He's not there.
he's not even there. Who sinned? And my man, his ears perked up a little bit. But he's sitting there, but not only that, but sitting there and listening to people talk about him coming and going all day, just like he's just invisible. So what was Jesus' answer? Verse 3, Jesus answered, it was neither that the man sinned nor his parents. It was in order that the works of God might be displayed in him. Now, does that mean that God caused the man to be blind for this day? God said, okay, you're going to be blind and it's going to come about. You think?
You can't help but think that, but
I
don't know.
I just can't. That just doesn't fit with what we know of God. And he's going to set this up for that. Well, the man was blind. However it happened, he had no ability to see. And he had never had that ability to see. And ultimately, yes, it was the result of sin. When you look at it in the sense of we live in a fallen world where bad things happen. Bad things happen to everybody. We shouldn't be surprised that we use the quote all the time, bad things happen to good people. Bad things just happen that we may or may not have control over. And the man was blind. But Jesus said that it was in order that the works of God might be displayed in him. God chose to use the man's affliction, this naturally occurring affliction. He was not the only man in all of Israel that was blind. There were many others who were blind for whatever reason, whether it was a birth defect, whether it was an injury, whatever. He was not the only man to be blind. It was a naturally occurring affliction, and God chose to use that affliction for his own glory. John MacArthur said the disciples' focus was backward, analyzing how the man came to be in this condition. The Lord's concern was forward, on putting God's power on display for the man's benefit. But the best quote I ran across, I really like, F.F. Bruce put it this way. He said, God overruled the disaster of the child's blindness. Think about those parents when that child was born, and if it was that there were no irises, whatever it was obvious that this baby is blind. This baby will never see. Imagine what went through those parents' hearts when that happened. God overruled that disaster so that when the child grew to manhood, he might, by recovering his sight, see the glory of God in the face of Christ, and others, seeing this work of God, might turn to the true light of the world. I mean, talk about your divine appointment. I mean, how special was that? Well, then what did Jesus say? Verse 4 begins, he said, we must work the work of him who sent me. So hold that right there. That word must is a really interesting word. It's a very powerful word. We kind of read over it. We must work the works of him who sent me. But the word is very strong. It's very powerful. It means an impelling force. It's I cannot not do this kind of situation. Jesus told Nicodemus, you must be born again. John the Baptist said, he must increase and I must decrease. Jesus said, I must needs go through Samaria. I love how the King James puts it that way. I just love that. It's like, he must needs go through Samaria. And there he met a woman at the well, and he said to her, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. And here he said, we, and he's speaking of himself and the disciples, and you and I today, we must do the works of the one who sent Jesus. How long? As long as it is day. Hebrews 3:13 says, exhort or encourage one another as long as it is called today. It's always today. It's always today. 1 Thessalonians 5:8 says, since we are of the day, those of us who are believers, we are of the day as opposed to those who are of the night. We need to, in the context of 1 Thessalonians, we need to be vigilant. There's a song that it's in our hymn, you may have heard it. It says, we need to work for the night is coming when man works no more. But Jesus was talking to the disciples and saying we. Now, if you remember back in chapter 5, he said I am doing the Father's work. I and the Father are working. The Father works and I must work. So why did he say we now? What's different about chapter 5 versus chapter 9?
Well, he has following. He has followers.
He has followers. In chapter 5, he had not commissioned the disciples yet. He was on his own. He was speaking for himself then. But it is after, in John's Gospel, between chapter 5 and 6, that he commissions the apostles. But here it's we, because the apostles are with him. They have been commissioned. Now he has, and this also speaks to us. So then Jesus added in the rest of verse 5, verse 4, we must work the works of him who sent me, as long as it is day. Night is coming when no man can work. In verse 5, while I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And I just need to say this about that. We've talked in these last few lessons about the two Greek words that make up the distinctive I am. That's not what's in this verse. This is not the definitive statement that Jesus has said, I am the light of the world, or as he will say in chapter 10, I am the door, or I am the good shepherd. This is not that. This is just as you would use I am in the course of everyday language. In fact, that first I am there, while I am in the world, the word there for I am is a word that simply means be. While I be in the world. That doesn't, in our English language, that doesn't flow very well, doesn't read very well. But while I be in the world, and then that second one is I'm. It just exists. It's not the two words that means God. It's just in the course of everyday language. He's not declaring that he is God here. But in verse 6, what did he do? When he had done this, he spat on the ground. Now, I've got to tell you this because this is just one of those things that's just too cool. The word spit, or spat as it is in this, is the Greek word patu.
Oh.
Now, I mean, how perfect is that? I told Joe, and he said, you're going to use that, aren't you? I said, of course I'm going to use that. That's just too cool. You need to know that it's just patu. That's what that word is. Okay, so he said, he spat on the ground, and he made clay of the spittle, and he applied the clay to the eyes. So how is this different from other times that Jesus has healed people? And I gave you a bunch of verses, scriptures to look up if you took time to do any of that. I usually, whenever we were doing that Disciplers Bible study and we had a whole list of scriptures like this, I would use that Bible app on my phone so I could just scan to them and read them real quick without having to look them up. But what did you find? How did Jesus heal other times?
He spoke it.
He spoke it? What else did he do? Do what? He touched. Remember the leper? He touched him before he healed him. What else?
He did spit at another time.
He did. He did spit it on it. It's not the first time he'd been put to
the
it.
dirt.
Right. He didn't mix it with dirt, but
No.
what else?
Some just came to him, so just his presence.
Yeah, just his presence. All different kinds of ways for him to heal. But notice this. The man did not ask to be healed. The man's sitting there minding his own business. Now, Bartimaeus, I love blind Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus cried out, "Thou son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus said, "What do you want?" And he didn't stutter. "Lord, that I may see." I mean, he was definite in what he wanted. But put yourself in this man's place. He's sitting there minding his own business like he has done every day since he's been old enough to be brought to this place and left there alone. And he's left there to beg. And then this man, and he can hear this, he hears people coming and going. This particular man comes, and he's got other men with him. He doesn't know how many there are. Just he hears them come, and they stop at him. Now, does he listen for the sound of the coin hitting his cup or whatever he has? Is he in anticipation of what they might give him? But he's sitting there listening. And they start discussing him, just like he's just there, just like he's not there. Then without warning, he hears the man spit. And then you hear him doing something, and he just, what is he doing? And then you feel him putting this stuff on your eyes. What is up with that? What in the world? Just imagine what's going through this man's mind, because Jesus, unless he says something that's not in the scripture, nothing is being said. He spits. He needs this clay. Think about exactly what he did specifically. He spit. He mixed the spit with dirt. He kneaded it enough that it made a sticky ball of clay and stuck to the man's eyes. I mean, you have to have enough moisture mixed with enough dirt that doesn't fall apart. It had to be just the right amount, and it stuck to the man's eyes. I can't imagine what's going through this man's mind.
And then did you think that the disciples helped him get to this?
We don't know. Apparently not. But before we get to that, think about this. Why do you think Jesus did it this way? What's up with that?
Well, man was created out of dust, and he needed new life.
That's one of the things that showed up in several of the commentaries. That Jesus, as creator, created eyes for the man out of the mud, out of the dirt. That's a possibility. There is some actually I had this before that answer, but there is some evidence in the ancient world that the ancient world believed in the healing properties of spit or saliva. Maybe we think the same thing, right? You get smudges on you. Kids got to smudge this napkin, this handkerchief, wipe their face. What's the first thing you do if you burn your finger? Stick it in your mouth. Well, maybe not if you got a mask on, but what do we do with our child's boo-boos? We kiss them. And actually the thought is that some of the reasons for that have to do with these ancient traditions. There were actually some documents from some of the early historians, Pliny the Younger, whoever he was. Anyway, told about this man that particularly if someone was fasting and how much more some of these commentaries go on and on with this stuff. But some of these ancient traditions thought that there was healing properties in saliva. But why did Jesus do that? Did Jesus have to do that to heal the man? No. He didn't even have to say anything. He didn't have to touch him. Just like we said about, if you remember when we talked about when Jesus turned the water into wine, we said that Jesus allowed the servants to participate in the miracle. They didn't have to fill the water pots up, but he allowed them to participate in the miracle. This man was, in a sense, allowed to participate in the miracle, but the man needed to obey because of what would come after this, how he would be grilled about this afterward. One of the, as Linda said, the creating it out of the dust of the earth was one that was more prevalent. But one other commentary put it this way, and I thought, that's a little bit of a stretch. But he said, by putting mud on the man's eyes, Jesus was providing an irritant that would make the man want to obey and go wash it off.
That's too far of a stretch.
That's a little bit of a stretch for me. But we don't know. The bottom line is we don't know. We don't know why Jesus did it this way.
Is it possible that people had great difficulty believing in miracles anyway? They had to see something with their own eyes.
Yeah.
Something coming together, something happening, something being done.
Yeah.
For others' benefit.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part of it. We like to understand. We like to do things. If we can do something, if somebody's sick, if we can do something, if we can take them some food, if we can just do something. I remember this thought just flitted through my mind. My grandmother passed away when I was 10 years old, and I was very, very close to her. But she had an aneurysm, and she was laying in the bed at home before they took her to the hospital, and she had, this horrendous headache. And I remember as a 10-year-old going to the bed and saying, "Mama, is there anything I can do for you?" And she said, "No, darling." I never will forget that. "No, darling." But you want to do something. You just want to do something. And so they had something that they could see that was done. And so the man had something to do. As we said, Jesus didn't have to do that. But the bottom line is we don't know why he did it that way. Now, there may be many spiritual pictures here. And we could spend a lot of time talking about the types and the shadows and the pictures. This represents this or that. But look at verse 7. When Jesus did this, he said to the man, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." He gave him something to do, something that allowed him to participate in what was being done. Now, we could ask why the pool of Siloam. There's some indication that the pool of Bethesda was a lot closer. Might the man have been tempted to go to the nearest place with water and wash it off? If it was an irritant in his eyes and he just wanted it off his face. Might there have been a temptation to go to a closer place or to go to some other water source and do that? We don't know. The pool of Siloam was near the southeast corner of the city wall. If you just picture in your mind, as the city is laid out with the wall around it, the south toward the bottom east corner of the city wall. It was a good ways away. John tells us that the name of the pool, Siloam, means sent. And it originally got that name from this tunnel that Hezekiah built. This is a fascinating story. I forget, I didn't mark down where it was. But anyway, I think it may be in Isaiah as well as in 2 Kings. But anyway, Hezekiah, the northern tribe of Israel, had already been taken into captivity, and the Assyrians were attacking the southern kingdom. And they had enough food and so forth to hold out, but they didn't have water. And so it was evident that this attack was going to come. And so Hezekiah, a brilliant engineer, sent workers on both ends of this from where this pool, or where this spring was in Gihon, and where this source was in the city, to dig a tunnel and to meet in the middle. You think about how difficult that would even be today. But in Hezekiah's day, and they did it, and they met. And so water flowed into the city. So they had food, they had water, and they were able to hold out in the siege. But we remember also, in that, we saw that the water was sent from the Gihon spring to the pool in the city through the tunnel. But we remember that the water for that pouring ceremony every day in the temple during that Feast of the Tabernacles came from this pool of Siloam. They would make that procession out every day and get the water and go back. You remember, the people did all the dancing and the singing and chanting and stuff as they went back. This pool of living water. We've also talked a lot about the word sent in John's Gospel. Over and over we read about Jesus being sent. And the word Siloam is also translated as Shiloh, which is another name for Jesus. So maybe it has something to do with how his going symbolizes the blessings that are sent to Israel. But ultimately, Jesus the Messiah is the one sent from God. But on a practical note, in a purely literal note, the man was told to go, and he went. He obeyed. And I asked you in your lesson about another time when someone was told to do something really unusual to be healed. Did you read that story? About Naaman? I love that story of Naaman. I love the little servant girl. Well, if he told you to do something, really hard, you'd have done it. All he did was tell you to dip in the Jordan River 7 times. But this man did it. He went, he obeyed, and he came back seeing.
He was healed from leprosy. Wasn't that what
Naaman, he was healed from leprosy by dipping 7 times in the Jordan River. I mean, Elijah did, is it Elijah or Elisha? You read that? I believe it was Elijah. I can't, anyway, Elijah or Elisha, one or the other. He didn't even go to the door. He just sent his servant until I told him. Naaman didn't like that at all. That tickles me. But anyway, so this man. The rest of this story with this man revolves around 2 questions. First of all, is this really the blind man? And how does he now see? 4 times this question is asked of how he was healed. And 3 times he's asked specifically. 1 time his parents is asked. And that makes it look like this is a thorough investigation. We're getting all the facts. We're asking all these times, and we're making sure we got all the facts. When actually it's just, as we would say here in the South, just beating a dead horse. They didn't have anything else to say. It was all they keep asking this. So first of all, look at verse 8. What 2 groups were the first to respond? His neighbors and those who previously saw him as a beggar. So this is something that I think we tend to read over a lot of times. That's why I really want you to look for, follow the pronouns, who are the they, make sure you know who all the players are. We read over this, and we're talking first of all about 2 groups. The neighbors, that would be the people that would know this man and his family and grew up and, neighbors to him, and those who saw him there as a beggar every day. So these 2 groups of people. And they were saying, is not this the one who used to sit and beg? Now that phrase, used to sit and beg, indicates that he had his place. You would always see this man in this place. You can count on it. You go in the door, there he's going to be. He's got his spot, just like we have our pew seat, He had his place. That's where we used to see him all the time. And then, verse 9, there were others. So you got the neighbors, you got those who used to see him sitting there, and then there were others who were saying, well, this is he. And still others, we're up to 4 groups now, still others were saying, no, but he's like him. And the man keeps saying, it's me. It's me. Hey, it's me. I was there. I recognize your voice. I was there. It's me. As soon as the man could see, he became a witness of Jesus' healing. His very presence caused a reaction. Think about these 4 groups of people. Just the fact that the man can see caused these reactions in 4 different groups of people. And as we can see, it was easier to believe in a mistaken identity than to believe in the miracle. So look at verse 10. And they were all saying to him, how then were your eyes opened? They were all asking. It was all 4 of these groups, and they were all saying, how is it that your eyes were opened? And the man answers for the first time. And he said, the man who is called Jesus. And this is the first time he's told the story. And we don't know if he's already told his parents. We don't know if he's told it anywhere else. But this is the first record we have of him telling it. And he answered and said, the man who is called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. And so I went and I washed and I received sight. Doesn't say I recovered my sight. Doesn't say I was healed. I received sight. That, I think, leads us to believe that it was true he had never seen. Either he didn't have eyes or the eyes were not fully formed or whatever it was, but he had never seen. And so he now has received his sight. The tense there, when he said received sight, the tense there is, it's called aorist. It means I see and I continue to see. I see and I still see and I still see and I still see. It's continuous. But think about this. He said, the man who is called Jesus. Now, how did he know it was Jesus?
He probably would have heard the disciples call him that.
Yeah, well, the disciples, and I looked back on that. The disciples asked Jesus, saying, Rabbi, who sinned? So they don't say his name there, but I'm sure he had heard the name. So he at least knew that it was some man named Jesus. That's all he knows about him at this point. So verse 12. And they, so who's the they now that we're talking about? They said to him, I don't know if this is still all four of those groups, if they're still all talking or someone, but someone within these groups said to him, where is he? And the man said, I do not know. Like the man in chapter 5 that was at the pool of Bethesda, waiting on the waters to stirred. And he was so intent on watching the waters that he didn't even see the man that touched him and healed him. So this man has no idea where Jesus is. It was kind of comical. I was listening to a sermon last week from John MacArthur on this, and John MacArthur said, they asked him where. The man doesn't know where what. He doesn't know where anything is. He's never seen anything. What do you mean where? What's a where? So, but the man, he doesn't know. Where did he go? I have no idea where he went. He just knew that he could see. So, any comments or questions on this section before we go on to the examination? Okay, the first examination, verse 13. The scene changes now. And this is probably not the same day. As it reads here, verse 13, we don't know which of these people did this, they brought to the Pharisees him who was formerly blind. Now, like I said, this probably was not the same day. This was probably another day later. Because verse 14 tells us, John tells us, it was a Sabbath day. It was a Sabbath on the day that Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. So it talks like it's past tense. It was another day, not this day. So who are the they? Were these friends of his or not? Now, think about this. This is a different day. So it's probably not at least the four groups, but who could the they be? Were they friends of his or not? Were they just wanting to share this wonderful experience with the Pharisees? Or did they want to try to expose Jesus? Or did they genuinely have a question? Where did they bring him? To the Pharisees. Notice John doesn't say the Jews here. That and I'm still not really there's got to be something to that. The fact that he sometimes calls them Pharisees and sometimes he calls them the Jews. I haven't quite figured that out yet. I thought I had a handle on it, in that when he calls them Jews, they are definitely antagonistic to him. And when he calls them Pharisees, there are at least some who have sort of come to believe. But then I ran into another one that didn't fit. So I don't know. I just think there's got to be some reason for that. But anyway, they brought him to the Pharisees. Why the Pharisees? Now, I will say this. When John says the Jews, we know he's talking about the religious leaders, which can include Sadducees and chief priests and scribes and Pharisees. These are specifically Pharisees. Why did they bring him to the Pharisees? Any idea?
Maybe the Pharisees actually had people watching.
Could have been.
They're always out there.
Yeah.
They're always keeping.
They got their eyes out there. Yeah.
They're keeping an eye on everybody.
I think they are, but I think there's a different reason here. Actually, if there was any question of law, by rights, you were to take that question to the Pharisees. That was their responsibility. That's what they did. They were responsible for answering questions about the law. So it was the right thing to do to bring him there. Verse 14 tells us, as I already read that, it was a Sabbath day when this took place. So think about this. Yes, it was a Sabbath day, and the Sabbath had been broken by what Jesus did. But the result of this breaking was that a man could see. So what's that mean? You remember back in chapter 7 when Jesus talked about circumcision being on the 8th day. If it happened to fall on a Sabbath, you did it anyway because it took precedence over. And we talked about a lot in that lesson about extenuating circumstances. Other times Jesus healed people on the Sabbath, not necessarily because it was a life-threatening thing. It certainly could have waited till the next day, but I believe it's in Mark. I don't remember what chapter it's in, but Jesus said, and we use this saying a lot. If your ox was in a ditch, you would get it out. We use that saying about working on Sunday. We'd say, "Well, I had an ox in the ditch. I had to get this done." That's where that comes from. Jesus would say there in Mark, "Is it not the right thing to do to alleviate someone's suffering?" And so they've got this question. Whether they were friends of the man or whether they just really had this question, okay, we know he's broken the Sabbath, but the man can see. How do I process this, to use our terms?
Do you think it was intentional? Jesus did a lot of things on the Sabbath.
Oh, yeah.
And the Jewish leaders, that was their thing, so sometimes you can't see the forest from the trees.
Yeah.
You're so rule-bound.
Yeah, exactly.
It seemed to really mess with their world a lot.
Oh, yeah, exactly. In chapter 5, we talked about him going to the pool of Bethesda and healing that man on the Sabbath. We said that man had been in that condition, I believe it was, 38 years or something. And we said, 24 more hours is not going to kill the guy. There were a lot of those things. But what Jesus was teaching was the extenuating circumstance. What's the right thing to do? Not only right according to the law, but what's the right thing to do? So we don't know what their motivation was. They may have just genuinely had the question, and so they took it to the Pharisees. Now, this was not just a group of Pharisees, there's a group of Pharisees, let's go ask them. No, this was an official gathering. More likely, this was a local synagogue Torah court. Now, the court system in Israel in Jesus' day was very similar to our court system in that there were local courts And then there was a higher court, and then a higher court, and then a higher court, and then you finally reach the Sanhedrin. Just like in our courts, you go from one court to the next, and you finally reach the Supreme Court. That's the way it was in Jesus' day. You didn't take just the smallest matter to the Sanhedrin. You took it to the local synagogue first. If they couldn't solve this problem or answer this question of law, then they would go up to the next court. I didn't take the time to look that up. When we were doing our study in Matthew, I ran across a whole section in one of my commentaries on teaching on this court system, and it was fascinating how it worked. But you didn't go to the Sanhedrin first. You worked your way up, so that's what they did. They went to the local synagogue first. And so the scribes, who were mostly Pharisees, were responsible for answering questions of the faith. If you had a question about anything, you took it to the scribes or to the Pharisees. And this was not just your ordinary healing. This was not just somebody who had been injured and got well. This is not just someone who had had the pink eye and got over it. This was an entirely different, completely different thing. Blindness caused by illness or injury could go away. It could get better. But this man obviously, we don't exactly know what was so obvious about it, but something about it was he had obviously been blind from birth. Something was different. And the Pharisees couldn't supply answers. So, verse 15. Again, therefore, the Pharisees also were asking him how he received his sight, and he goes along with them. And he said, he applied clay to my eyes, and I washed and I see. Every time he's telling it, he's leaving a little bit more. Let's just cut to the chase. He put clay on my eyes. Well, you had to know that there was some liquid there somewhere. He put clay on my eyes, and I went and I washed. Did the man really change any of the details? No, he didn't change the details. But there were, and there always are, two reactions. Look at verse 16. Therefore, some of the Pharisees were saying, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. But others, this would be other Pharisees, we're talking only about Pharisees here. Other Pharisees were saying, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? And that word signs there is that word Simeon we've seen so often in John's gospel. It's the word John uses as a translation for it has in my Bible here, an attesting miracle. It is a sign that only Jesus can do. When you go to the end of John's gospel, he'll talk about these signs he did, these specific signs he did to prove who he was. This was one of those signs. So there's this division. We saw back in chapter 7, verse 43, the crowd was divided about Jesus. There were those, he can't be from God when he does this. Well, yeah, but nobody can do what he's done. In verses 47 through 52 of chapter 7, there seems to be a division brewing among the Pharisees as well. But there's definitely a division here. They can't deny that the man in front of them can see. No question. The man can see. And so they asked the man for his conclusion. And what does he say? He's a prophet. Well, that didn't help matters any. Pure and simple. He's a prophet. Isn't it amazing? Isn't it amazing how your reaction to something is when it happens to you versus when it happens to someone else? The man could see. He's a prophet. I don't know about that. Because it happened to somebody else. I had a friend one time ask me if I'd ever experienced a miracle of any kind. And I said, well, if you mean one that can't be explained away by somebody else, no. But I do have things that happened in our lives that we consider miracles because they happened to us. And the way that they happened, we believe that they're miracles. Now, somebody else might look at it and say, well, this and that, you can explain it away. But it's different when it happens to you and you know it's a miracle. The Samaritan woman, we are told in John 4:19, perceived that he was a prophet. Why? Because he told her everything she'd ever done. Many of the people in John chapter 6 believed Jesus to be the prophet because he met their needs. He healed them, he taught them, he fed them. And no one else had ever done that before. And now this man has received his sight, something that he has never had before. And he believes Jesus to be at least a prophet. And we'll see, even if not a prophet, at least he's surely someone sent from God. So, verse 18. What does John specifically call these Pharisees? What's he calling them now? Verse 18. The Jews. See, he's changed that. And I keep thinking there's got to be a reason for that. I haven't found it yet, but he calls them the Jews. The Jews, therefore, did not believe it of him, of this man, that he'd been blind and had received his sight until, that word until there is a compound Greek word, and it's a very powerful word. It doesn't appear to be that powerful in our English language as we read it, but it has a very strong turning point. It's like a hinge on a gate. It turns the whole situation. They did not believe that he regained his sight until they called the parents of the very one who had received his sight. In other words, I won't believe it until I hear it from his parents that he's never been able to see. You can't make me believe he has never been able to see. Because now they're looking at him, and if it was eyes that were created, he has eyes now. So they don't have anything to compare it to. Well, apparently, the parents wanted to stay out of it until the Pharisees subpoenaed them or whatever it is that they did. But at any rate, they called the parents to appear. And as we read it in our Bibles, in our translations, we read it as three questions, basically. Is this your son? Was he born blind? And how can he now see? Three separate questions. But in the Greek, it's just one question, and it's stated in such a way that's designed to trip them up. I'm a big Law and Order fan. I've seen that before. This design, they're going to get them. Well, how did the parents reply? Well, they sidestepped the issue. Verses 20 and 21. The parents answered them and said, well, we know that this is our son. And we know that he was born blind, but how he now sees, we do not know. Or who opened his eyes, we do not know. Ask him. He's of age. He should speak for himself. Now, whether they really knew or not what happened, we don't know that part of the story. We don't know if as soon as the man could see, he went and told his parents. We don't know if there had been some sort of an estrangement between them. I mean, what parent is going to make their child beg? But maybe there was no other way. I mean, we don't know the facts around that. All we know is that they show up and they answer the least amount that they can answer. And I asked you, I said, how did these words strike you? How did the parents' words strike you when you read them?
Almost like they didn't believe it either.
Yeah.
They seem detached from it.
Yeah. They're detached. It just, a lot of the commentaries that I read talked about it. There's just something about, I mean, you can't really put your finger on it, but there's just something about it that they don't sound like very loving parents. But perhaps they were just fearful. Because we know what the outcome of this would be. In verse 22, John gives us this little bit of editorial information that says his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess him, that would be Jesus, to be the Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue.
Well, they weren't that fond of their son to say, go ask him, though. Like, okay, we want to protect ourselves, so go to him and he can.
Yeah, he's of age, ask him.
Yeah.
Just leave us out of it. There's just something about that it just sounds distant. Yeah, but again, it could be because they were afraid. As I was studying this, I really never found a satisfactory answer in any of the commentaries that and I looked at a bunch of them. This thing that was said here in verse 22 that the Jews had already agreed if anyone should confess Christ, this person will be kicked out of the synagogue. I really couldn't find the answer I was looking for. If it were true, that's a major issue. Everything about Jewish life, social, political, business, religious, everything about Jewish life revolves around the synagogue. Now, you would think it revolves around the temple, and it does. Feasts, sacrifices, so forth. But their day-to-day life revolved around the synagogue. And I remember this from our study in Acts, when it says Stephen went into the synagogue. It's called the synagogue of the freedmen, like First Baptist Synagogue or something. They all had different names. But during that time, there were as many as I remember, something like 400 synagogues in and around Jerusalem during Stephen's time in Acts. It's like a church on every corner. And there were different groups. The synagogue of the freedmen were made up of those Jews or proselytes who had lived in other areas and had come to live in Jerusalem. So there were all different kinds of synagogues there. So their lives revolved around what took place in the synagogue, a lot like it was maybe in our younger years. You remember everybody went to church and you made your connections at church and you met somebody, fell in love in church, or you had business dealings with people in church. Every time there was an election, your church membership would swell because all the politicians would come to church. Those things happen. So that's the way it was around the synagogue. And just to think about, most of the commentaries I looked at really spent more time on explaining how this unsynagoguing worked. That's what it was called. You would be unsynagogued. Jewish writings stated that there were 3 levels of being unsynagogued. 2 of those were disciplinary, but the third was a type of question. I gotta skip a page there. The third was more permanent. It was actually excommunication. The first one would last for 7 days, and if there was a second offense, it would last for 30 days, and then finally it would be permanent. And so they were very afraid of this happening to them. But on the other hand, and I put this in your lesson, in the book of Acts, we find the disciples and other believers still attending the synagogues, like Stephen, for instance. And Paul, on Paul's missionary journeys, every time he went into a city that had a synagogue, that's where he went first. So I really couldn't find, like I said, a satisfactory answer to this. I don't find anywhere else that this takes place, but whether it was real or imagined, whether it was real or just a threat, the parents believed it to be true. And so they said, yes, this is our son. Yes, he was born blind. Yes, he can see. They couldn't deny the miracle. They knew this baby. They could not deny the miracle. But other than that, I know nothing. Reminds you of Hogan's Heroes. Sergeant Schultz, I know nothing. They just literally did not want to know anything else. And so they didn't. And verse 23, for this reason, his parents said, he is of age, ask him.
David, do you think they could have given him
birth, knowing his condition, could they have taken him to the synagogue, temple, or whatever for somebody else to raise? And now they're in a position where, like, oh, maybe we shouldn't have done that. And so,
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that. I don't know if that sort of thing happened.
I don't know either. I don't know what they were
That's-
doing, but
I didn't run across that in anything that I read, but I didn't really look for that direction either.
and I think that's why the parents would have said, ask him. We don't know.
Yeah.
This is what we do know.
Yeah.
He was our son. He was born blind, but
Other than
we
that,
have to ask him because we're not a part of his life.
that's really what it sounds like. Now, whether that was because of the intense fear of being kicked out of the synagogue and they'd lose maybe their livelihood or whatever, not willing to lose their jobs and their lifestyle, or it could be that they had no dealings with him. I know it just seems like a very, very unloving communication.
Children were not allowed to be children for very long.
No, they really weren't.
Girls were expected to start their adult lives very early, and probably boys never had a child.
Yeah,
like a
because
children's
just to
life.
eke out an existence,
Yeah.
just to make enough to eat and to live on and to meet your daily needs. That was your, there was no leisure time. There was no such thing.
You worked or you
You worked or you didn't have. Right, exactly. That's a good point, though. I'll see what I can find about that. Anything else on this before we go on to the second examination? Okay, so verse 24. So they call the man back in. And the second time, they call the man who had been blind and said to him, "Give glory to God." Now, does everybody's translation put it that way? Is it worded any different? Give glory to God. That's almost like you're under oath. Now, that's what that means. Let's see. Speak the truth in the presence and the name of God is literally what that means. Give glory to God. You're under oath. Tell us the truth. We know this man is a sinner. And so he has to reply to that. And then verse 25 is one of my most favorite, if that's acceptable English, my most favorite verse in the Bible. He therefore answered, "Whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know. Whereas I was blind, now I see." Man, I love that. That is such a powerful, powerful statement. Speak the truth in the presence and the name of God. The only testimony that any one of us can give is a personal testimony. You don't have to know all the theology. You don't have to know all the scriptures. You don't have to know all the stuff. All you have to know is this one thing I know. I was blind, now I see. That's all you have to know. So this man has a personal testimony and he gives it here. He had an argument they couldn't answer. And so they asked him again, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" And at this point, the man's had enough. I've just had it. 3 times. Verses 10 and 15 and now again. And then in addition, his parents were asked, "How were you healed?" The real question here is not how, but who. We talked about, particularly in our Tuesday night group, we talked about being literal, ultra literal. And we saw that, the Pharisees did that when they said to Jesus, "How can you be 50? You're not 50 years old yet, and you saw Abraham." They were being ultra literal. When really, I don't think it's that the people really misunderstood. They didn't want to believe. And so That's as good excuse as another. In chapter 3, Nicodemus wanted to know how to enter his mother's womb a second time and be born again. You must be born again. Well, how am I going to do that? He really didn't want to know the answer. In chapter 6, the Jews wanted to know, well, how does this man think we're going to eat his flesh and drink his blood? Because they really didn't want to know how. And then in chapter 7, as I said, the Pharisees wanted to know how Jesus, not yet 50 years old, could have seen Abraham, and Abraham seen him. And it wasn't that they didn't know, they just didn't want to know. And now, they want to know just how putting mud on unseeing eyes could cause them to see. How did he do it? It doesn't matter how he did it, he just did it. It was not, they really didn't want to know how. They just didn't want to know who. So look at how the man replied, verse 27. He said, I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? You can almost see the light bulb go on. Say, you don't want to become disciples of his too, do you? I mean, you can just hear the sarcasm dripping in his voice. And so, look at their reply. And they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoke to Moses, but as for this man, we don't even know where he's from. As I read this, I had to wonder if some of these Pharisees, now as we said, this is probably taking place at least a few days later after the event of the healing. The healing came on the heels of chapter 8 and that argument there over, your father the devil, and, we're children of Abraham, and that grew to the point of them picking up the stones to throw at Jesus. So this is at least a few days later, maybe not a lot, but a few days, I think, enough to where perhaps the emotion had calmed down a little bit. And so I have to wonder, as I read this, if some of these Pharisees were among those that argued with Jesus that day. I mean, we saw how their frustration erupted then, and just reading this, you feel their frustration. They can't get the better of this man. They couldn't get the better of Jesus, and they can't get the better of this man. Basically, they're saying, don't confuse me with the facts. So they try to create this division between Jesus and Moses. And we see that in John, we see that in the other Gospels. But as you read this, you can begin to feel the momentum shifting. They're losing control of this hearing, as it were. And the man is clearly taking charge of the proceedings. Now look at what the rest of what he says in verses 30 and 31. The man answered and said to them, well, here's an amazing thing, that you do not know where he's from, and yet he opened my eyes. Well, that was just fuel on the fire. We know that God does not hear sinners. If anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he hears him. Since the beginning of time, it has never been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. I gave you several scriptures to look up about why God does not hear sinners, and I don't want to take a lot of time with that because we're running close to here. But I've been listening to a teaching lately on Isaiah, and I hope you looked those up and saw those scriptures. But I've been listening to this teaching on Isaiah, and so I heard another one from Isaiah 1 verse 15 that says, God hides his eyes from those whose hands are covered with blood. Now, how does that fit into current events? And Proverbs 15:29 says, the Lord is far from the wicked, but he hears the prayer of the righteous. There have been times when I've heard people say, not particularly to me, but I've heard, speaking on TV or this place or the other, I've heard people say something like, you're in my thoughts and prayers. And I thought, I don't particularly think I want you praying for me. There are some people that I really just don't want praying for me. But as I said in your lesson, although there are not instances of anyone being healed of blindness in the Old Testament, there are prophecies all over the Old Testament that it will happen when the Messiah comes. So what conclusion did the man draw from this? Verse 33, he said, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. The man had an argument they couldn't answer, and so their response was, oh yeah? No. Verse 34, they answered and said to him, you were born entirely in sin, and you're going to teach us? And they put him out. That seems to be their answer for everything they can't deal with. They run you off, they throw rocks at you, or they put you out of the synagogue. They just don't want to deal with it. So they put him.
They're just unable.
They're just unable. They just can't deal with it. So then in our final section, and in our next lesson, we will pick back up again with this, because this will flow into chapter 10. And I really wanted you to see how that flow is. So we'll pick back up, particularly with verse 39 next week. But in verse 35, we see that Jesus heard about this court action, and what did he do? He sought the man out. And what did he ask him? He said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Now, you got to realize this guy does not know Jesus from Adam. This man comes up to him and says, do you believe in the Son of Man? Now, the man replies in verse 36 and said, who is he, Lord? Or really the better word there is sir. Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? Now, the man is not asking who the Son of Man is as far as who's the Son of Man or in the scheme of things. What he's asking is his identity. He doesn't know who he's talking to. He calls Jesus sir. That's the sense of the word, because he doesn't know that this man talking to him is Jesus. It was like the Samaritan woman in chapter 4, verse 11, when she simply called Jesus sir because she didn't know who he was. But then in verse 26 of chapter 4, Jesus said to her, who speak to you am he. And as we saw then, what Jesus actually said, the word he wasn't there. What Jesus actually said was, I who speak to you am. And she knew. And Jesus says to this man in verse 37, you have both seen him, and he is the one who is talking to you. And then we know that the man believes, because look at what he did, verse 38. He says, Lord, again, and yes, it's the same word as sir, but look at his actions. Lord, I believe. And what did he do? He worshiped. And that word worship is he fell down before him. So we know there is a difference in the word. He worshiped him. In verse 35, the Pharisees accused the man of being born in sin. But this man who had been born blind, would not die in his sins, as we saw in chapter 7, verses 21 and 24, because it said there in chapter, is it 7? No, chapter 8. Chapter 8, 24. Jesus said, I said therefore to you that you shall, this is he's talking to the Pharisees, you shall die in your sins, for unless you believe that I am, you shall die in your sins. Well, this man believes in the I am, and he will not. He may have been born in sin, as we all are, but he will not die in sin. Ooh, I really wanted to touch on this last part just quickly, because we're going to pick up with 39 again next week. But apparently there are many others who are overhearing this conversation between Jesus and the man. And because Jesus makes this proclamation in verse 39, and he speaks out to the group, for judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. And we'll spend a lot more time talking about this next week because this is a very important statement. It's very important for us to understand. I asked you to compare this to John 3:17. John 3:17 says, "For God sent not his Son into the world to condemn the world." And the word condemn there means to judge. "For God sent not his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved." So, is Jesus not to judge, or is he to judge? That is the question. Think about it this way. Just let me leave you with this. Jesus is not saying here that he has come to execute or to carry out judgment. Right here. That's not what he's saying. What he is saying is that his very presence constitutes a judgment. In other words, Jesus' mere presence brought judgment. How? Because anytime anyone looked at him, they had to make a choice. He wasn't doing the judging, but his mere presence caused a judgment. So, at that, we'll close this lesson then, and we'll pick it up next time.